Next in the program, it is my pleasure to introduce Dani Nedal. Dani is a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Politics and Strategy at Carnegie Mellon University. He studies international relations with a focus on international security, nuclear weapons, and power and authority in international politics. His book project explores how national security policy is shaped by countries' urban geography and the vulnerability of cities to modern warfare. Before joining IPS, he was a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Security Studies program, a Smith-Richardson Fellow at Yale International Security Studies, and a managing editor at International Studies Quarterly. Before earning his PhD at Georgetown University, he worked as research fellow with the Institute for Conflict, Cooperation, and Security at the University of Birmingham, the International Politics Department at Aberystwyth University, and the Center for International Relations at the Getulio Vargas Foundation. A couple of tongue twisters there, but please join me in welcoming to the stage for a talk about direct and indirect risks from great power competition, Dani Nedal.
Thank you. Good job. All right. Thank you for the introduction. Is this too loud or is it just me? Ooh. Thank you for the introduction. Thanks for having me here. Thank Amy and Barry and the others for putting this together and for inviting me to talk to you today. There's going to be a little bit of overlap between what you just heard from Brian, I suspect. And then if you're curious, you want to hear more about this even more, Brian and I are doing a meetup at 5. So without any further ado, let me tell you a little bit about direct and indirect risk from great power competition. First, I want to very briefly, without getting into the nitty-gritty of it, define what I mean by great power competition. Some of you may have thoughts on what it means and may be familiar with what we mean by this. Some of you may not spend much time thinking about this. Who do we mean by great powers that are competing? Generally, we think about the P5, right, the 5 original nuclear powers. I would say that if we're thinking 5, 10, 15 years from now, we also should probably include some other countries and political entities on that list. What are they competing about? They're competing not just militarily, but they're also competing politically, diplomatically, and economically, meaning they're competing over allies, they're competing over markets, wealth, power, whose values get to predominate in the international political system, status, and the reasons they compete are various, and we don't necessarily have to get into why they're competing. But if we start from the assumption that we are witnessing an era of heightened competition between great powers, and that's an assumption that we need to run with because it's a definite possibility. Again, we all saw Phil Tetlock's talk today. I'm an issue area expert. I'm a political scientist, which means that you should not trust my predictions. This is a very conditional forecast. If we are witnessing heightened political competition between great powers, here are some things we should really worry about because they're real risks. And here are some reasons why you should all in this room worry about this, even if we don't get to nuclear war. So let's start with nuclear war because it's, I think, the most obvious reason why we should care about this. Even if nuclear war doesn't reach extinction level risks, and that's something that we can talk about, the circumstances under which this is likely versus unlikely. But we should talk about nuclear war as a potential risk. And again, we know that the risk of nuclear war is low, and we're all happy about that. And we can all sleep safely at night knowing that it's not going to happen today. It's probably not going to happen tomorrow either. But the likelihood of a nuclear war, not necessarily general nuclear war, that devastates humanity, I would say that the baseline risk is slightly higher and increasing as a result of a few trends that are troubling. One is the fact that deterrence is just inherently harder with more nuclear powers, and powers are competing over a variety of positional goods in the international system and status in different areas of the world. The other is that the state of affairs today, the fact that we have 9 nuclear countries today versus 20 or 30, which is what experts thought was going to be the case in the 50s and 60s, the fact that we only have these 9 nuclear powers, despite the fact that nuclear technology is not that complicated, right, that we've had mastery of the atom for a good 70 years now, is largely a product of things like US primacy and a desire to maintain that primacy of a good amount of great power concert between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and US-centered globalization that shaped the incentives for countries in the system and outside the system to refrain from engaging in nuclear proliferation out of concern of being marginalized. A lot of these assumptions are being undermined by trends in international economic power and political alliances. The other factor we should all worry about is the unending search for quote-unquote usable nuclear weapons, right? Tactical nuclear weapons, low-yield nuclear weapons, low fallout, no fallout nuclear weapons, missile defense, a first strike capability, right? The ability to deliver a splendid first strike that disarms the enemy and allow you to pursue your goals unhindered, not having to worry about retaliation. These things are not new, but we are witnessing a renaissance in all these areas, and they all make for a more terrifying nuclear environment. Then, of course, we have the problem that some of the norms that have underlined non-proliferation, arms control, and non-use patterns in the last 60 years, we have evidence that these are being undermined, that if there was ever a taboo against using nuclear weapons, that taboo is weaker now than it has been in a long time. A lot of studies of US public opinion have showed that the general public is a lot more comfortable with the use of nuclear weapons in certain circumstances than we would like to think. I think most of us in this room, we're very uncomfortable with the use of nuclear weapons in almost any scenario other than retaliation against nuclear use. The general public is not so squeamish. And that terrifies me and a lot of people who have in the past been very optimistic about a taboo against nuclear weapons. And what this means for the mobilization of an anti-nuclear movement and the prevention of further proliferation and further pursuit of limited nuclear options is deeply troubling. And we see a lot of the similar patterns happening in places like India and Russia and China. They're also engaged in rapid modernization of their nuclear forces and engaged in the same kind of creative thinking around nuclear weapons. And this is leading to, or at least contributing to, the potential for the unraveling of a lot of the foundational international regimes that deal with nuclear arms control and proliferation and disarmament. Despite some promising developments with the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, we don't see a lot of buy-in from the countries that we would need to see buy-in from to be optimistic about this. Another direct risk from great power competition turning violent is not necessarily the direct confrontation, the direct military confrontation between great powers, but the tendency of great powers to fight indirectly through regional intermediaries. Great powers can have these two roles as mediators or peacekeepers, preventing things from escalating out of control, limiting or de-escalating crises and conflicts, but they can also act as spoilers or provocateurs, inciting regional conflict or preventing it from being resolved peacefully or from being resolved at all, as we're seeing in Syria today. In an age of heightened great power competition, we're more likely to see the latter than the former. And we know from a lot of research that this, both during the Cold War and before the Cold War, leads to much bloodier, much longer wars, especially when you have great powers involved. Any kind of external intervention tends to produce lengthier, bloodier conflicts. When great powers get involved, things tend to escalate a lot more dramatically. So we should worry about the humanitarian impacts and the knock-on impacts for regional stability and for the ability to maintain development efforts in places like Africa, Central America, and Asia. And of course, there's a potential for escalation, right? The war may start as an indirect proxy war, but we had close calls when proxy wars almost escalated to general war during the Cold War. We definitely had cases in which proxy wars escalated into general war before the Cold War, before we had nuclear weapons. And there are reasons to believe that the mechanisms that led to controlled escalation and limited escalation during the Cold War may be weakened because you have a lot more players, because the response times may be shorter, because disinformation is easier. Maybe you have a deep fake involved. We can workshop reasons why escalation might be more likely arising out of a proxy war. Then we have the indirect risks, and this is what I really want to kind of try to sell you on, because direct risks I think are fairly easy to grasp. But the indirect risks are more likely to affect you on a day-to-day basis as citizens, as entrepreneurs, as policy entrepreneurs, as activists, as philanthropists. And by indirect risks of cooperation breakdown, I basically mean the fact that in an age of heightened political competition between great powers, almost by definition what we see is an increased focus on the distributional gains from cooperation in a variety of issue areas. Generally, there's always, in any kind of bargaining situation, any kind of cooperative game, you're going to have some focus on distribution of gains, who wins more, who gets the better deal, right? But in an age of heightened political competition and heightened fears and distrust that any kind of relative advantage may be exploited down the line in ways that are unrecoverable, you're going to have shorter bargaining ranges, you're going to have more focus on these relative gains problems that mean that cooperative arrangement that may be socially optimal may not be reachable because the countries involved are too focused on distributional consequences, either on the short term or the long term. And if that's the case, increasing the shadow of the future of the policymakers might not necessarily lead to more cooperative behavior. It might actually lead to more conflictual behavior, depending on how the leaders think the future is going to play out. So just telling them, okay, but just think more long term, which is I think something that in the EA community people really want to do. In these situations, it may not be profitable to promote long-term thinking in the same way. You might need to tweak the message a little bit. In these situations, what we tend to get is less policy convergence. And less policy convergence is a bad thing because, well, it's a bad thing if the policies are properly designed, and if we think that the transaction costs of having policy convergence are positive. And I think that in this community, we tend to think that they are, because we're not necessarily worried about protecting our own sectors, right, protecting our parochial interests against competition. We tend to think that good policy should be adopted across the board because we want to maximize human welfare, right? And there's going to be some variation in how policy is implemented to account for societal and political differences, but generally we want policies to travel, and we don't want to lose time and money and effort by having a variety of different regulatory environments for different countries just because it maximizes my own personal or corporate interest. So we could be looking at a period of disorder, or at least order fragmentation, which I think this relates to what Brian was talking about earlier, where you have a bifurcation or even a more complex network of different countries pursuing their own policy projects, pushing their own policy agendas and regulations onto their spheres of interest, and you have certainly this fragmentation or segmentation of international order and regulations when it comes to excuse me, industry, environmental standards, and so on and so forth. It might also mean limitations on cross-border activity. I think is also is something that we care about. A lot of us here are operating transnationally, multinationally, and we rely for our day-to-day work on being able to transit freely, unencumbered, to different countries, places in which you enjoy certain protections just by virtue of the work you do. And we're already witnessing complications with this. We're already looking at much more restrictions on the work of NGOs and transnational civil society organizations in places like China and Russia, but also in India and in Brazil. So we can expect heightened political competition between great powers to lead to these governments looking more suspiciously at transnational actors that are doing things like promoting animal welfare or promoting cooperation on climate change or promoting development in particular ways that are based in particular countries. Again, a lot of this is things that we're used to, but we should worry about this becoming a greater problem. And the general implication is that this makes it just harder to deal with problems that are global in nature, at least trans-regional in nature, whether you're talking about preventing pandemics and limiting biohazard risks or preventing global catastrophic risks of different natures. As long as what we're talking about requires global cooperation and involves massive costs for the countries involved, you're going to see a harder environment for these kinds of arrangements. the general infrastructure that we relied on to build a lot of this community work, the general structure of international society, the UN system, and things of that nature, might be coming under strain. You already see a massive funding crisis for the UN system today as a product of great power competition and a distrust, both from the usual suspects of who we thought was going to be the big spoilers or the big revisionist powers in the system, but also at the core, right? It's not just these rising powers that are the problem. The core countries that built the system, or at least acted as the main drivers for the development of this order, are also going to question the utility of an order that allows for the emergence of these powers. And we're already seeing a lot of evidence of this today. There's a couple of troubling trends that I would say that interact with this and further drive great powers to compete and complicate efforts at trying to forestall this. One is just the emergence of a variety of different types of particularism or parochialism. And you can think about particular virulent strands of nationalism, ethno-nationalism, of racial and racialized discourse, and very exclusivist types of civilizational discourse that pit the Western Judeo-Christian civilization against some vilified other. This is of course, this has been with us for a long time, and it's not going to go away, but we're seeing the popularity of these types of discourses supplant what was, I think, in the 90s and early 2000s, a more cosmopolitan, universalist set of discourses particularly at elite levels, where we could count on a particular degree of support to views of international solidarist norms and institutions, things like R2P, and just a bevy of global human rights regimes that were fairly commonsensical. We're seeing a lot of resistance to this today, not just in emerging powers, but again, at the very core of the international system. This, of course, accentuates competition, accentuates the drive to compete, the status anxiety that is driven and that helps drive this particularism. It doesn't just affect local and national elections, it affects international competition as well. There's a lot of good work on how racial and racialized discourse limits global cooperation. It undermines trust and empathy that are required to overcome some of the monitoring and enforcement problems of cooperation, some of the bargaining enforcement problems. This tends to make cooperation harder. And for a lot of these political movements, and again, it's important to note, as a social scientist, I have to remind people of this. These identities, they are not essential. There's nothing natural about these identities. They're political movements. They're subject to contestation and reformulation. There's no such thing as Western civilization, right, as this thing that walks around. It's been reconstructed and weaponized in a particular way, and it tends to follow the vilification of things like global governance and global cooperation and things of a more cosmopolitan bent. And so it's set up as a foil to efforts of global governance. The second, and this is something that I think a lot of you spend a lot of time thinking about, is the decay of the breakdown of trust in experts, in science, in disinterested observers, in journalism. This is what Jennifer Kavanaugh at Rand has called very cleverly truth decay, right? This inability to trust in any kind of observable truth. And this, first of all, weakens mechanisms of political accountability in democratic societies. It's harder to keep elected leaders to account if they can easily manipulate the views of public and can play on the polarization of opinion. And this reinforces that polarization and gives this informational asymmetry and advantage to people in particular positions of power, because they can manipulate opinion in ways that they can't when you have a free, disinterested media and a free, disinterested class of experts and educators that can serve as arbiters of information. So, some opportunities for EA organizations to help. Some conditions I think favor change. I think expectation shocks are going to be a big opportunity for us. The failure of globalization to deliver the goods to most societies in the way that it was promised has prompted a lot of this backlash that we're seeing. I believe, and this is again one of those forecasts that we're going to have to test out, the failure of these particularist movements to deliver the goods that they're promising is going to lead to a second expectation shock, where we're going to have an opening for alternative ideas. I think the Yale community is one particular source of new ideas to deal with both the failure of the standard liberal internationalist project, but also the failure of sort of the reactionary international movement. We're going to need alternative ideas, and I think the Yale community is a good spot for those to emerge. We have a new generation of experts in public policy, in political science, national security, that are less wedded to the traditional ways of thinking, that are open to different ways of thinking that might be coming from EA and other communities. It's a more diverse body of scholars and experts and policy makers. They're going to be more open to learning different ways of approaching these issues. It's a field starved for resources. The NSF has cut political science funding. The people who fund traditional work on national security spend quite a bit, but they don't spend as much as you would think, given the importance of some of these issues. There's a lot of space for new funders to influence the shape of the field. And the polarization is actually comparatively low. If you compare it with issues like abortion and euthanasia and UBI and others, there's actually a lot less polarization in issues of national and international security. We can have conversations productively across the aisle, as it were. And I think this lends itself well to a community that embraces diversity of views. And there's synergy. There's a lot of synergy. There's a lot of complementarity between the goals that I'm proposing here of preventing this kind of cooperation, this kind of competition and conflict, and the various goals that the Yale community already embraces, like the humanitarian universalist principles that are so central to the community, and the general interest in trying to maximize the effectiveness of these investments. The problems that we have are with the closing of the wonk mind. It's really hard to get radically new ideas in play. If you compare the way that policymakers talked about world peace and disarmament in the 1950s and 60s, right? We have the archives. There are a lot of very kind of pie-in-the-sky ideas about these things that we just don't see today in discussions inside the Beltway or in other places. There's a lot more pragmatism, and I think that's kind of the trade-off of the evidence-based, science-based approach. You kind of lose some of the creativity and some of the boldness of spirit. And I think we can inject some of this back by bringing new ideas outside of the general fields where people are coming from, which are law, political science, IR. And of course, there's the problem of policy access, right? In the US, policy access is somewhat easy. In some places, not so much, right? If you're talking about China, if you're talking about India, talking about Russia, policy access, the ways to get the EA community to shape the discourse and shape the way things are studied might be a little trickier, but doesn't mean we should find them impossible. And of course, it's an area where it's really hard to affect policy change. There's a lot of structural force and a lot of powerful vested interests that we're going to be fighting against, and it's difficult to measure impact, right? And this, I think, is something that the EA community is very open to. And we need a lot more work to be done on how to measure impact and how to measure the quality of cooperation among great powers and among states in general. We have a lot less research on how to measure and how to determine the causes of good cooperation and lengthy cooperation. And I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. So what can you do, very briefly? I have 3 minutes, I see you. First, you can vote, and this is just kind of the basic civic message. Hold leaders accountable. Pay attention to their policy platforms on foreign policy. Don't make it just a secondary issue. Very few people in this country take foreign policy seriously as an electoral issue, right? Few people vote on foreign policy, and of course that's natural. It's not clearly impactful in daily life. It's not as polarized. It's not as salient. It's not like abortion. It's not like religion. It's not like your next paycheck. But it has knock-on effects, and so if you can, make it a big issue, make it a part of your conversation about electoral politics, and hold leaders accountable, call them, mail them, and so on and so forth. And making international cooperation part of your cause. A lot of you already do, of course. That's not news to any of you. But making international cooperation part of your cause might also mean embracing the fact that international cooperation and the infrastructure for international cooperation might be breaking down in important ways, and future-proofing your organization against it, right? It might be hard to forestall great power competition. It might be hard to affect it, but you can definitely prepare for it when it comes, right? There's a lot of reasonable ways in which it might affect your own work, and trying to build coalitions nationally and internationally with partners who share the same values, who you may disagree with on other issues, but can give you the access to try to prevent things from getting out of control, is, I think, a reasonable and low-cost approach. Trying to just think about what might be the effects for you, for your organization, for your cause, if great power competition really does become a lot more intense, and if some of these dynamics start to play out. And Brian and I are going to be holding a meetup later on to try to workshop some of these. I don't have all the answers, right? I have my own causes to worry about, but we can definitely workshop it and talk it out and try to think together about how your cause might be affected by some of these dynamics, if they do pass. Again, not a prediction. Educate your peers. A lot of people are not aware of the biases that their bubbles sort of inhabit, and we know that general policy elites and the millionaire class, the billionaire class, tend to be a lot more hawkish. It's not probably true for the millionaires and billionaires who inhabit this bubble, but it's definitely true for their extended networks, and educating those extended networks on the dangers of great power competition and conflict, again, is a low-cost strategy. And again, educating and mobilizing the public. We need more investment in the educational infrastructure on this. The American public in particular is severely undereducated on issues of international politics. We have pretty good evidence that other countries are a little better than the US, but not necessarily much better. And so investing in education, the right type of education on this is also important, and a little goes a long way. Investing in education in this and research on this is not that expensive, and I'm happy to talk to you about it. I've just done some research on particular levers to influence the shape of fields like international security, and I'm happy to talk to you about it. Finally, invest in some reformist, evidence-based, fact-based projects, but also put some money behind some crazy ideas. Help scientists step out of their comfort zone and think about crazy ways to change the world. There's a lot of appetite for this in political circles. There's a lot of new, young progressists and libertarians and liberals and conservatives who are starving for new ideas that they can take to their constituents on foreign policy. A lot of people want to escape the kind of the sameness of foreign policy discourse and international politics discourse. We've seen some initiatives that are very promising. There's a burgeoning field of think tanks in DC and in London looking at foreign policy, national security from different perspectives, but we can see a lot more of that. And make globalism great again, right? Globalism doesn't have to be a four-letter word, doesn't have to be a pejorative. Embracing the world as your oyster is not necessarily a bad thing. There's nothing wrong with patriotism if it's positive, right? There's nothing wrong with valuing your ethnicity, your religion, your identity, but there's nothing wrong with thinking of the world as your community. And we need to go back to valuing the discourse a lot more, and come to our meetup. That's one thing you can definitely do. That's it.
All right, thank you. Not too much time for questions. It's all good. One that came in from the audience is how clearly history is not over, as we might once have hoped that it would be. But how do you think that the specifics in terms of relative power of the different great powers play into how we should be thinking about what happens? I mean, it was, once US, USSR, then it was kind of, we're headed to a multipolar world, now it might be US, China, or maybe not. But I guess, how do you survey that scene, and how does it impact what you think about downstream?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's one of those perennial questions we've had at least since the end of the Cold War. Right? What's the system look like now? And some people would say it's unipolar, some people would say it's multipolar, multipolar, apolar, nonpolar. The terminology is endless. I think we can all agree that what we have is sort of unipolar with a lot of power diffusion in different issue areas. And so what it means is that we're going to have differences in approach, and we're going to have different environments depending on what the issue area is, right? In some issue areas, say economic regulation, financial regulation, the EU is a great power, no doubt about it. In security terms, questionable, right? The fact that Pakistan has nuclear weapons immediately brings it to the great power stage if you're talking nuclear weapons, if you're talking nuclear security and non-proliferation, disarmament. But its economy is a fraction of the size of India's, right? It's about, what, $200 billion? It's a tiny economy. It's a huge population, but it's a tiny economy. So it doesn't, so the criteria for inclusion in that list is different, and the implications for who gets a seat at the table, who gets a voice on some of these issues are going to be, your mileage may vary. My sense of this is we're going to get a lot more disorder just because you can't necessarily predict to have the same players in all the tables like you could 30, 40 years ago. So it's really going to depend on the issue area, which has implications for the EA folks. If you're talking AI, right, whether or not you have the technological capability to be a major player and set the rules is going to determine whether you get a seat at the table. So Japan definitely gets a seat at that table. South Korea probably. I don't know if India does. I don't know if France and the UK do. So it's yeah, that's my shortest answer possible.
So another question, thinking back to some decades ago, obviously there was kind of very clear philosophical paradigms that were competing, right? Capitalism, communism. That seems to be much less what's going on today. Obviously there's a Chinese model, but it's not like China's out there trying to get everybody else to adopt the Chinese model. Instead, what seems to be happening, as you kind of alluded to, is globalization hasn't delivered the goods, and a lot of the problems that we see seem to be coming from sort of disaffected groups within countries, and this same pattern essentially is kind of playing itself out across so many different societies. So do you see, and you mentioned one that I think some people are very interested in, which is universal basic income as potentially sort of a balm to put on that burn. Do you think that does that appeal to you as sort of a possible approach? And do you see other approaches to sort of heal individual societies? Because it seems like what we would have thought of as the elites up until, or the people running the show up until very recently, do still want to cooperate, but in some cases they're just being denied the opportunity to do so by their own citizens.
Right. I think we have a lot of ideological disagreements without having coherent ideologies. We definitely have socialism. It's the socialism that was the most popular socialism during the Cold War, which was not communism, it was European-style socialism. It was the most popular in the world, and it still is. It hasn't gone away, it just has lost the sheen of socialism, but it's still there. I think there are potential ways out of this, of reinventing liberal internationalism with a more social democratic bent. That's, I think, one of the few coherent approaches we have emerging out of the political discourse in the United States. The other, of course, is just straight up nationalism. And it's been embraced not just in the US by Trump, but also in China and in India. Hindu nationalism is a major political force in India and in Brazil and so on and so forth. So we do have a reemergence of nationalism. And nationalism is less content-rich than, say, liberalism, but not any more content-rich than fascism was. We tend to backward induce a lot of coherence ideologically onto fascism, but there are very, very few points of contact between Italian, Japanese, and German fascism. But we still saw a lot of cooperation happening between those countries, and we might see that again. We see a lot of transnational right-wing cooperation from this white nationalist, white supremacist movement in, say, Hungary, Italy, Brazil, so on. And I don't think you can discount that as a major threat to liberal internationalist projects or to socialist internationalist projects. So again, it doesn't have to propose a new set of institutions and a new order productively, as long as it makes it harder to maintain and sustain the liberal internationalist project. It's still something that we should be very concerned with. So
just to make sure I have that clear in my own head, you're saying there is no real coherent goal, as far as you can tell, of these sort of right-wing nationalist movements, yet they cooperate to basically just their own self-preservationist ends?
Yeah, they cooperate to advance their own national agendas, and they've been extremely successful in doing so. There's a reason why Steve Bannon is running across Europe, helping get fascists elected in Italy, and helping national militarists get elected in Brazil. There's a reason why they're cooperating, why the NRA is globally present, and so on. There's a real transnational right-wing corporate movement that disagrees on a lot of the end goals, but agrees on a few of them sufficiently that they don't want communism, whatever that means for them, and they don't want pluralism and diversity.
So I can't end on that note. You mentioned that you would have more to say about the opportunity to shape fields of research. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that, and certainly a field of research would be, what do we do about that you just spoke about?
So one simple thing we can do is take a look at how we think about cooperation and conflict in the study of political science. There's vastly superior amounts of research and money being funneled into understanding coercive modes of conflict resolution, coercive diplomacy, conflict, political violence. There's a lot of money and research being done on this, and I've benefited from this. I'm part of the problem. I've done a lot of this work, right? I'm plugged into those communities. We have a lot less work being done on how to understand cooperation, and what does it mean? How do we get good cooperation? How do we get lasting cooperation on different issue areas? How does diplomacy actually work? There's a lot of good work being done on this, but not nearly enough, given the fact that diplomacy and cooperation are a lot more prevalent than conflict. We have a lot more of it, and we just don't know how it works very well, and how to produce more of it. So we can fund more efforts at data collection, at scientific studies of cooperation. There's a lot happening, again, and Phil Tatlock was here. He's working with Bob Axelrod. A lot of the work that Bob has pioneered for the last 50 years has been foundational for this, but there's a lot less than there should be. And putting money into this and shaping the incentives for scholars of international relations to take cooperation seriously, not as an afterthought and not as the absence of war, but as sort of the main thing that happens in international politics, and trying to get a handle on it would be terrific.
Yeah, badly needed.
Yeah.
Well, for more, you'll have to go to office hours. But for now, how about a round of applause for Dani Nedal? Thank you very much.